The mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was established in 2001 by the Commission on Human Rights, which is the predecessor to the current Human Rights Council, the intergovernmental body of the United Nations charged with promoting human rights throughout the world. The first mandate holder, the first person to be appointed to the mandate, was the distinguished Mexican anthropologist and sociologist Rodolfo Staffenhagen, and he held the mandate until 2008, and in that year I was named to the mandate. At that time, the Human Rights Council had replaced the Commission on Human Rights and amplified the mandate to incorporate references to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, establishing, in my view, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as an important point of reference for the work of the Special Rapporteur. And so I have, in my work as Special Rapporteur, seen the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the principal normative framework for the work, so that in examining the situation of Indigenous peoples around the world and writing reports and making recommendations about those situations, how to address violations of the human rights of Indigenous peoples, I look to the Declaration to provide that the standard to be applied. In general terms, the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, as established by the Human Rights Council, is to monitor the conditions of Indigenous peoples worldwide and to promote recognition and effective exercise of the human rights of Indigenous peoples in accordance with relevant international standards. The relevant international standards include, in particular, those that are set forth in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007 with the affirmative vote of the vast majority of the member states of the United Nations. And so the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples represents a consensus on a worldwide level on what the content of the rights of Indigenous peoples. I work in four main areas. One is country visits and reports, and that entails visiting a country, actually physically going to the country and meeting with Indigenous peoples, often going, in many instances, going to Indigenous communities, as well as meeting with government representatives whose work is relevant, government officials whose work is relevant to Indigenous peoples in one way or another. These country visits are complemented by research that I and the people who support me do, research about the situations of the Indigenous peoples of the country. And the visits result in a report that includes recommendations that are aimed at trying to assist in addressing the problems that are identified. The report includes an evaluation of those problems, as well as an evaluation of good practices that may be in place. And the recommendations are aimed at building upon those good practices and addressing ongoing concerns. A second area of work has to do with communications that I receive from Indigenous peoples and other sources on a daily basis about specific instances of violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. And these communications come by email, they can come by fax or by mail, ordinary mail. And upon receiving them, I evaluate the information, and if I find it could be useful, I address a letter to the government concerned, raising the concern with the government in an effort to try to promote a resolution to the situation of a violation of Indigenous people's rights. Sometimes that results in a dialogue with the government, both through correspondence and, in certain instances, actually sitting down with government representatives, either in the country concerned or in Geneva, where governments have permanent missions, in an effort to promote a dialogue, in an effort to promote some kind of resolution to those specific concerns. In appropriate instances, I will send a letter to a government raising the issue that is raised to me in a communication in an attempt to instigate some kind of response that can help resolve the situation or address the situation in some way. Sometimes I will do a public statement in the form of a press release or other document about the situation to raise awareness about it and call upon the government to take corrective action if it's a particularly urgent situation. In certain instances, I will make a site visit to look at the situation that's been raised. For example, I've done that with regard to allegations of human rights violations in connection with the construction of dams on Indigenous peoples' territories. I've done that in 2 instances in connection with dams being constructed on Indigenous peoples' territories. And that is, again, an attempt to examine the situation closely and raise the situation with the government in order to see how it can be resolved and bring a condition of respect for human rights of Indigenous people, of the Indigenous peoples concerned. A third area of work has to do with thematic studies, or involves the development of studies around thematic issues. Issues of cross-cutting concern to Indigenous peoples around the world, such as the issue of consultation, free, prior, informed consent. That's one of the issues that is raised to me perhaps more than any other one, the issue of the lack of adequate consultation, the lack of free, prior, informed consent with regard to decisions by the states or others that affect Indigenous peoples. And so this is a thematic issue that I've taken up and reported on. Related to that is the issue of extractive industries on Indigenous territories. And extractive industries has been a concern of Indigenous peoples worldwide, and again, an issue that's been raised to me repeatedly. So I'm currently undergoing a study on extractive industries. And a fourth area is the promotion of good practices, which involves assisting with developing for the future good practices, and developing legislation that will promote respect for Indigenous people's rights, that will promote concrete programs that will advance Indigenous people's rights, development of constitutional reforms that will incorporate Indigenous people's rights into the constitutional framework of countries. This kind of work falls under the rubric of promoting good practices, which is a fourth area of work. And all of this is to try to, in a constructive way, engage with Indigenous peoples, governments, and all relevant actors to the extent possible in building awareness about Indigenous peoples' concerns, both generally and in specific instances, and developing concrete practical measures to address those concerns and to establish conditions by which Indigenous peoples can truly be in enjoyment of their internationally recognized human rights. When I decide to do a country visit, it's usually after I have received a request by the Indigenous peoples or Indigenous organizations from the country that I'm to visit. That's not always the case, but it's usually the case. Sometimes Indigenous peoples in a very vulnerable situation, for example, the visit I did to the Republic of Congo last year, that is in 2010, where the Indigenous peoples there are in very dire conditions and really aren't aware of the international system or the mechanisms that exist to protect human rights, even the concept of human rights, much less the existence of my mandate. But in those situations, I may initiate on my own a visit precisely because of the especially vulnerable conditions of the Indigenous peoples in the country. But usually it's following a request. I conduct a visit following a request by Indigenous peoples of the country, as was the case with my visit to Argentina. Secondly, I need to have an invitation from the government of that particular country. The government has to agree to the visit. These country visits are really, in many ways, extraordinary because they involve the official presence of an international mechanism represented by the Special Rapporteur of Indigenous Peoples, and that requires then an invitation from the country concerned. And I go about getting an invitation by requesting one. And that's not always easy. It's not always easy to obtain an invitation. In many instances, countries don't respond, or they respond by saying maybe in the future, or they respond in some instances by saying no. But it's just it is one of the limitations of the system that an invitation is required. After I receive an invitation in writing through official channels, then we proceed to organize the visit with the help of those who assist me at the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and others, particularly those that help me at the University of Arizona. We work directly with Indigenous peoples, their representatives, to the extent possible to organize the visit, particularly the visit that entails going to communities, meeting with Indigenous representatives. We see that we see it as fundamental to working directly with Indigenous peoples to organize those parts of the visit. And of course, to organize the parts of the visit that have to do with the government, we work directly with the government. It's often a very complex endeavor to put together the various components of the visit, to put together the agenda, which involves going to various places throughout the country, meeting with different groups, meeting with different Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples or nations, as well as meeting with all the relevant government officials. And I usually am received by government officials at a fairly high level, which is usually characteristic of the importance that governments give to these kinds of visits and the official nature of them. Usually ministers or vice ministers, or sometimes even I've met with heads of state, and that helps to give visibility. Meeting at that level helps to give visibility to the issues that I'm examining in a particular country. So we always try in the preparation of the visits to arrange the visits in order to provide maximum visibility to the issues we're going to look at, and to provide maximum exposure to those issues. Country visits are about promoting a constructive dialogue with all the actors concerned in order to help processes already in place that tend toward greater respect for Indigenous peoples' rights, to shed light on those situations that need attention, and to promote action to address ongoing violations of Indigenous peoples' rights in a particular country. So it involves a multifaceted dialogue as well as a multifaceted evaluation of various issues and concerns, a multifaceted evaluation of progress already in place as well as the progress that needs to be made, as well as the situations in which Indigenous people's rights are simply not being respected and are in fact being violated. The intervention that I make through a country visit, it cannot itself or alone resolve a situation. That's not what I can do as Special Rapporteur, is to go in there and mandate a resolution. What it can do is help build upon processes that are in place. It can help Indigenous peoples in promoting their own initiatives by providing justification based on international standards through the written reports for their demands by helping to promote practical solutions to the issues that are raised, by helping governments to understand issues in a way that they may not have understood them before, by helping to shed light on issues that need that extra focus on the part of governments and other actors. It's a means of assisting, not of really going in and resolving the situation. It's the visit can't really accomplish that on its own, and it's not really designed to do that. And so Indigenous peoples can use a visit and the report by continuing to promote their own initiatives and using the reports that I develop in the country visit to justify their positions and to advocate their positions before governments and other actors. I think that we're in a new era of human rights advocacy, one in which we're moving beyond the era of recognition of human rights, including recognition of Indigenous peoples' human rights. There are now a number of human rights instruments, including the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that set forth, that lay out what the content of those rights is. And there's a significant consensus about that content, about the character of the rights, and about what the standards are. The difficulty is those rights aren't implemented on the ground in the everyday lives of people in virtually every country where Indigenous peoples live. And so the era we're now in is that of implementing the rights, of moving from articulating the rights and achieving consensus about them and seeing them written down in documents. We're going from there now to actually seeing these rights implemented on the ground. And it's a very difficult task to move in that direction, to see those rights implemented on the ground. My predecessor, Rodolfo Stavenhagen, referred to what he called the implementation gap, the gap between the rights as recognized in written instruments, including instruments like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the gap between that recognition and their implementation in the everyday lives of people. And bridging that gap is a very difficult task, because it involves reversing deeply rooted trends and attitudes that involve, at bottom, racial discrimination against Indigenous peoples that go back centuries, literally centuries. Societal structures, economic structures, political structures that have operated to the disadvantage of Indigenous peoples and provide or make for conditions that on an ongoing basis result in one way or another in frequent, or in some cases ongoing, violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. Reversing these structures of oppression, really, what they are, structures of oppression, is quite a difficult task, and involves changing attitudes among governmental actors. It involves moving from an awareness about the human rights standards, the relevant human rights standards, at simply the international level, to awareness about those standards at the operational level among government officials that work in areas that are relevant to Indigenous peoples, like the natural resources ministries or sectors of governments, and the educational programs that governments and states have. At the operational level, we don't see the kind of awareness that there needs to be in all too many places. And so there needs to be a lot of work to raise awareness at the operational level within governments about these standards. Also at the societal level, it's often the case, and I would say invariably the case in situations where indigenous peoples live that the larger society, the majority, is simply oblivious to, is largely unaware of the problems indigenous peoples face, of the aspirations of indigenous peoples, of the cultures of indigenous peoples. There's a lack of, simply a lack of awareness. And so there's a lot of awareness raising that needs to occur among society at large. And unless that awareness is raised both at the societal level and the level of government within its operational structures, we're always going to see this gap. We're always going to see this gap. And so those things need to change. That lack of awareness needs to change, and there needs to be political will behind change that makes for that change to come about. And there has to be ultimately mutual understanding between indigenous peoples and other actors of the broader society and governments concerned. Indigenous peoples have shown themselves to be very generous in many ways, and generous in their willingness to see other people coming within their territories, and that's often worked to their disadvantage. For example, generous in their sharing of their knowledge, of their cultures in many respects. And that generosity needs to find some reciprocity from the broader societies. And when that happens, I think then we can start to see this implementation gap really start to narrow.